Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last day of Readers Workshop. We are finishing up our week on these read alouds, and we're doing point of view again because I really think it's important for us to know who's telling the story. Again, there's so many ideas about what point of view means, but I want to clarify that point of view isn't in this skill, it isn't your opinion about something, it's who's telling the story and whose point of view is the story being told. And so we're just trying to figure out who's telling this story. And we had our steps from last week. Our first one was we read part of the story, which I will choose for you to kind of give you some help. Then you're going to look for keywords. And it's the same keywords we used last time, which we talked about was our pronouns. And pronouns are names or words that we use to replace someone's name. Instead of always saying, Ms. Rosales, Ms. Rosales, Ms. Rosales, I can say she, right? Instead, because that makes our sentence have more variety. But there's one thing I added today, and it's the word names, because name is not a pronoun, but if we see names, that's going to be one of the keywords we look at too, because we should think about, well, who's saying that name? Who's using that name, so we can figure out who's telling the story. And we're going to ask the same thing, who is using that pronoun or now that keyword, okay? So the teachers and I are going to model for you the first three actually. And so what we're going to do is we're going to read the first one, and I'm going to have our teachers think of what keywords do you hear and how can we talk about how that's going to give us information about who's telling this story. Okay, here we go. The first one says, 2 cardboard boxes big enough to sit in hide inside. Bert and Etho take them out each day, climb up Sudden Hill, and sit in them. So again, we read the part of the story. Now let's go look for those key words. Do we see I, me, my, we, he, she, it, they, or any names? And if you do, give me a thumbs up, and we're going to talk about that keyword and who's using it. Ms. Rosales?
I remember you said names is a new one, so Bert and Etho.
Awesome. Bert and Etho are the names that are mentioned in this text. Now, this is the tricky question. Who is using that pronoun, or who is using that word, those names? Ms. Hernandez?
Well, it can't be Shu because he's not in this part of the story. Mm-hmm. And Bert and Etho are not actually the ones talking to each other. So I'm going to guess it might be the author who's starting to tell the story about those two.
Mm-hmm. Very good observation, Ms. Hernandez. And I love that you mentioned Shu, because some friends at home might think, oh, it's Shu who's watching them from afar. But we don't know about Shu yet. This is the very beginning of the story. So when we hear that the author is telling us the story, or it's their point of view, we call the author a special name. It's called the narrator. Okay, and I'm gonna write that there. And that might be a key vocabulary word for you. Sometimes, actually in a lot of our picture books, we hear the story in the point of view of the narrator. And the narrator is kind of like someone who's watching this happen, watching this story unfold, and not like Shu though, just completely outside of the events and just telling you what they are seeing. So the narrator does have a very important part in the story because it's in the point of view of what the narrator is seeing or witnessing. Okay, so awesome job. I'm glad that Ms. Hernandez, you helped us clarify that, because no characters in the story are telling us this in their point of view. It is through the narrator. Okay, awesome. Here's our second example. This is the next part of the story I'm going to read. Instead, he stays at home, mostly drawing pictures of 2 boxes side by side. But he misses Etho. He misses their cardboard castles on Sudden Hill. Okay, so again, let's look for those keywords, I, me, my, we, he, she, it, they, or any names as our keywords, and help us figure out whose point of view this is being told in. Ms. Akimowicz?
I noticed a lot of he, and so name Etho.
Awesome. I do see he and Etho, and now we're going to ask ourselves, who's using those keywords? Ms. Rosales?
I was really thinking that it might be an actual character, but now that I have this newfound knowledge with what Ms. Hernandez shared with us, I think it might be the narrator again.
Why do you think it's the narrator?
Because he's the one that is there seeing the emotions that I forgot
Bert.
his, that Bert is experiencing, but we know that Etho is with Shu up on the hill, so it can't be them. They're far away from him.
So what I heard you doing, Miss Rosales, is you're going into that scene and asking yourself, who is in that scene? And in that scene, we just see Bert. So if just Bert, he's not going to talk about himself saying he, so it can't be Bert. And you mentioned that Etho and Shu are not there. So again, if it's none of the characters in the story, it's going to be our narrator. He's watching, or he or she is watching and telling this story. So I love that strategy of put yourself in that scene. Think about who's watching Bert or who's watching this character and who might be telling the story in that example. Awesome. Okay, here you go to the last one. And this one I'm going to give you a warning is a little tricky. So we're going to have to work all together to figure this one out. One day, a knock on the door. One day he heard a knock on the door. He hears Shu's voice. We made you something. Please come out. All Bert can see as he peeks from the curtain is a box. So again, what are the key words you hear or see? I, me, my, we, he, she, it, they, or any names? Miss Hernandez?
Well, I do see he and we, but I also see Shu's name and Bert's name.
Love it. Awesome. I do see all those keywords as well. Now we have to ask ourselves, who is using those keywords? Miss Yakimowicz?
So from what I learned from Miss Hernandez and Miss Rosales, I see Bert in the picture, but in the words it says his name, so it can't be Bert. So it must be the narrator again.
I love it. Again, putting ourselves in the scene and asking ourselves, well, who's actually watching this happen? Who's telling this story? And I know that some of us might be a little bit tricked because of the quotation marks here, right? It says, he hears Shu's voice. We've made you something. Please come out. And you might be tempted to say, oh, it's Shu. Shu is telling this story. But remember, we're not asking you who's using the dialogue. We're asking you who's telling the story, right? And if it was Shu that was telling the story, it would say, I said, right? Because then it'd be Shu telling us the story, but that's not what it says. So be careful, boys and girls, when you're reading the story. Just because you see the quotation marks doesn't mean that's the person who's telling the story. That's just who's talking in the story. And there's a difference between who's talking in the story and who's telling the story. I know that's kind of tricky for our first grade brains. And it's okay if we make some mistakes, as long as you can explain where you got your thinking from, we can kind of walk you through this thought process, okay? Awesome job. So great job it is, narrator. So if you see a pattern in this whole story of Big Friends, it's just the narrator telling the story, okay? Now it's gonna be your turn. You're gonna use the exact same skill, the recipe card here, and you're gonna find out whose point of view is the story square being told in, using these same 3 steps, okay? So I'm gonna read you the text just in case you want help reading that. So the first one is, this is square, okay? So ask yourself, what are the key words you hear in this one? And this one's only 3 words, so you have very few to choose from. And then ask yourself, who's using that pronoun or that name, okay? And then next one you're gonna do 2 of them. This one says, it was beautiful, it was beguiling. It is perfect, said Circle. It is, asked Square. Yes, said Circle. So look for your keywords and ask who is using that pronoun or that name. And again, a hint, we're not looking for who's talking in the story, we're looking for who's telling the story, okay? So good luck. We cannot wait to see you try your very best, okay? Awesome job. See you guys next week. Bye.
Bye.
Don't forget to subscribe.